What if everything you were told was healing was actually hiding something darker? What if loyalty was rewarded more than honesty and silence was mistaken for love? Tonight, we are breaking down the moment that changes everything, because once you hear this, you cannot unsee it. And by the end of this video, you will understand why this story was never about growth, but about survival. There's a moment in every story where the truth stops whispering and starts revealing itself, quietly but unmistakably. And this moment happens not with shouting or confrontation, but with calm, reflective language that sounds like healing, but feels like something else entirely. Because when someone speaks about a life being burned down, yet insists on remembering it, cherishing it, and moving forward, the question becomes, why did it need to burn at all? And that is where the tension begins. Because beneath the poetic phrasing, there's an admission that cannot be undone. An admission that what once existed was not safe, not stable, not whole, despite how it was presented for years. And the audience feels that shift immediately, because this is not just about personal growth, it is about survival, masked as resilience. And as the conversation unfolds, the word unsafe enters the space, quietly, but its weight changes everything. Because for so long, that word was used to describe anyone who questioned, anyone who pushed back, anyone who asked for accountability. And now it is placed where it was never allowed before. And that placement creates a crack in the narrative that has been carefully maintained for a very long time. Because when someone finally acknowledges emotional instability, unpredictability, and fear, it forces a reevaluation of everything that came before. And the suspense builds, because instead of concern, instead of curiosity, instead of a pause to examine what that means, the response is reassurance, validation, and praise for loyalty and endurance. And that is where the dynamic reveals itself fully. Because loyalty in this context is not about mutual respect. It is about remaining present through discomfort without resistance. And when loyalty is rewarded more than honesty, the environment does not become safer, it becomes quieter. And the viewer feels that tension growing because accountability is mentioned, but only in words, not in outcomes. And it becomes clear that the purpose of these acknowledgments is not repair, but relief. Relief for the one who wants to feel absolved without changing behavior. And the loop tightens because the conversation circles around healing without ever touching responsibility. And the absence of change becomes louder than any apology. And the suspense remains because the audience is waiting for the moment where insight turns into action. But instead, the story resets again, praising endurance, reinforcing silence, and redefining survival as love. And the narrative continues to frame staying as strength, while leaving is implied to be failure. And that reframing keeps everyone locked in place. Because if endurance is the highest virtue, then pain becomes proof of devotion. Everyone locked in place. Because if endurance is the highest virtue, then pain becomes proof of devotion. And the tension escalates. Because children exist within this space, watching, learning, absorbing the message that harmony is maintained by managing someone else's emotions, and that speaking up leads to distance. And the audience stays engaged because they recognize this pattern, not as entertainment, but as something deeply familiar. And the story keeps pulling forward because each reflective statement sounds like a turning point, but never becomes one. And the loop continues because awareness without action becomes another form of control. And as long as reassurance replaces change, nothing truly shifts. And the viewer remains watching, hoping that the next admission, the next realization, the next reflective moment will finally break the cycle. But instead, it reinforces it. And the story continues, suspended between truth and denial, keeping everyone exactly where they are. As the story moves forward, the tension does not release. it deepens, because what initially sounds like growth slowly reveals a system built on emotional management rather than mutual care. And the viewer begins to notice that every moment of reassurance is paired with an expectation, and every expression of gratitude carries a condition. And the pattern becomes clearer the longer it unfolds, because praise is not offered for individuality or voice or strength, but for patience, for tolerance, for staying present through instability. And this creates an unspoken rule that love is measured by how much discomfort one can absorb without complaint. And the suspense grows because this rule is never stated outright, yet it governs every interaction, shaping behavior, decisions, and silence. And the audience feels the weight of it because it explains why reflection never turns into transformation and why accountability remains symbolic rather than practical. And as the narrative continues, it becomes evident that emotional safety is discussed but never prioritized, because safety would require change, boundaries, and shared responsibility, and those elements are notably absent. Instead, there is reassurance that things are better now without evidence of repair, and this keeps the cycle intact because improvement is claimed without being demonstrated, and the viewer remains engaged because they are watching a slow realization unfold, one that almost reaches clarity but pulls back at the last moment, choosing familiarity over disruption. And the suspense holds because each conversation feels like it could be the turning point, but resolves into the same pattern of validation and reward for endurance. And the emotional imbalance becomes more pronounced as attention centers on preserving comfort rather than addressing impact. And the silence around the children becomes more noticeable because they exist within this environment, absorbing lessons about relationships without being directly addressed. And the audience understands that what is modeled becomes normalized, and that normalization carries forward, shaping expectations and boundaries long after the moment has passed. And this realization keeps viewers watching because the story is no longer confined to one relationship. It expands into a broader reflection on how emotional labor is assigned unevenly and how responsibility is quietly shifted onto those who are most accommodating. And the narrative continues to loop back to loyalty, framing it as virtue while avoiding the cost of that loyalty. And the suspense remains because the viewer is waiting for the moment where someone asks the missing question: how does this affect everyone involved? But instead, the conversation returns to reassurance and praise, reinforcing the same structure. And the story becomes less about conflict and more about avoidance. Avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of change, avoidance of accountability. And that avoidance is what keeps the environment unchanged, despite all the reflective language. And the viewer stays because they sense the unresolved tension beneath every calm exchange, and they recognize that peace maintained through silence is not peace at all. It is merely the absence of confrontation. And the narrative continues to circle this truth without fully confronting it, keeping the audience engaged in the hope that awareness will eventually lead to action and that the cycle will finally break. But until that happens, the story remains suspended, repeating the same emotional rhythm over and over again, inviting viewers to watch not because they expect resolution, but because they are witnessing a pattern that mirrors so many real-life experiences, and that familiarity combined with unresolved tension keeps them invested until the very end. As the narrative reaches its most revealing stage, the tension no longer comes from what is being said, but from what continues to be avoided, because by now the pattern is fully visible. Reflection is offered, reassurance is exchanged, loyalty is praised, and the system remains unchanged. And the viewer feels the weight of that repetition because it mirrors the way cycles persist in real life. not through chaos, but through calm conversations that promise growth while preserving comfort. And the emotional rhythm stays consistent. One person expresses concern, the other offers validation, and the moment closes without disruption. And that is what makes this stage so compelling, because the absence of confrontation becomes the central conflict, and the suspense deepens as it becomes clear that the relationship is maintained through emotional negotiation rather than mutual engagement. And the language continues to frame endurance as virtue, reinforcing the idea that staying present through discomfort is proof of commitment. And this belief quietly dismisses the cost of that endurance, particularly for those who depend on stability and clarity. And the viewer remains engaged because the stakes feel larger now. This is no longer about one moment or one conversation. It is about a structure that has been reinforced over time and protected through selective accountability and controlled narratives. And the conversation continues to emphasize improvement without measurement, progress without evidence, and healing without repair. And that contradiction keeps the tension alive because each statement feels incomplete, and the audience senses that the most important truths are hovering just outside the frame. And as the story unfolds, the emotional labor remains uneven, with one person absorbing, managing, adapting, while the other receives reassurance and relief. And this imbalance is never directly addressed, yet it governs every interaction. And the viewer stays because they recognize the cost of this dynamic, how it slowly reshapes identity, priorities, and self-perception. And the silence around personal needs becomes more noticeable than any spoken affirmation, because needs that are never acknowledged cannot be met. And the suspense builds as the audience waits for a moment of assertion, a moment where boundaries are named or expectations are challenged. But instead, the cycle loops back to gratitude for patience and praise for staying. And the environment stabilizes without changing. And this repetition creates a quiet urgency because stability achieved through avoidance is fragile, and the viewer remains engaged. Understands that without intentional change, the same pressures will resurface again and again. And the narrative continues to suggest that awareness alone is enough, that recognizing the issue is the same as resolving it. But the lack of follow-through tells a different story. And this gap between insight and action is what keeps the audience watching, because they are witnessing a slow unfolding realization that never quite lands. And the presence of children within this environment adds another layer of gravity, because they observe these interactions and internalize lessons about conflict resolution, emotional expression, and self-worth. And the viewer senses that these lessons will echo long beyond the present moment, shaping future relationships in subtle ways. And that understanding creates a lingering tension that carries the story forward, because it is no longer about waiting for a dramatic break, but about recognizing how quietly patterns can persist and how easily comfort can be mistaken for safety. And as the narrative settles into this realization, the suspense does not resolve. It transforms into reflection, inviting viewers to question not just what they are watching, but what they have accepted in their own lives. And that is why the story holds attention until the end, because it does not offer easy answers or dramatic conclusions. Instead, it presents a mirror and asks the viewer to look closely and decide for themselves when awareness becomes action and when endurance stops being strength and starts being a signal that something needs to change. At the end of the day, real change is not about the words we say, but the choices we make. Safety is not proven through loyalty or endurance. It is proven through action, boundaries, and accountability. And until those things exist, the cycle does not end. It simply repeats, just quieter.